We've all heard the campfire stories. The boogeyman, who snatches kids from their beds. The crazed maniac, haunting a lonely bridge, his face hidden by a mask. They're the tales whispered at sleepovers. The legends that make the woods behind your house feel a little less welcoming after dark. They're just stories, right? Meant to scare us. Meant to give us a cheap thrill before we turn on the lights. And remember that we're safe. But what if the most terrifying legends weren't made up at all? What if they were born from real-life events, so horrifying they had to be turned into a story just to be remembered? What if the boogeyman had a name, a face, and a police file? Today we're pulling back the curtain on 3 of America's most chilling urban legends. We're digging past the folklore to uncover the terrifying, documented true crime cases that gave them life. We'll travel to the lonely roads of Virginia, the haunted hills of Pennsylvania, and the dark woods of Staten Island to find them. Because the truth is far more frightening than fiction. Our first story takes us to the quiet, affluent suburbs of Fairfax County, Virginia. It's a place of historic homes and deep forests. But it's also home to a particularly strange and lasting piece of American folklore: the legend of the Bunnyman. The legend, as it's usually told, is pure nightmare fuel. It all centers on one ominous location: a concrete railroad overpass on Colchester Road in Clifton. Locals don't call it the Colchester Overpass. They call it Bunnyman Bridge. The story goes that back in the early 1900s, a bus transferring patients from a local asylum crashed. Everyone was recovered, except for one patient named Douglas Griffon, a man who'd been institutionalized for killing his own family. He escaped into the woods, and for weeks, the only sign of him was a gruesome trail of half-eaten skinned rabbits hanging from the trees. The legend ends on Halloween night, when a group of teenagers are found hanging from the bridge, gutted just like the rabbits, and ever since they say the ghost of the Bunnyman returns to that bridge at midnight on Halloween, axe in hand, ready to attack anyone foolish enough to be there. It's a terrifying tale, a perfect campfire story. It has all the classic elements: the escaped lunatic, the cursed location, the brutal murders. It's been the subject of ghost hunts and slasher films, a local myth so powerful it's known across the country. But like a lot of legends that just refuse to die, there's a kernel of truth at its core, a truth that is in some ways stranger than the fiction it created. There was no asylum bus crash, there was no Douglas Griffon, and those gruesome murders of teenagers at the bridge, they never happened. But the Bunnyman was very, very real. To find him, we need to go to Fairfax County, Virginia, in the fall of 1970. The truth isn't in ghost stories. It's in official police reports and old newspaper clippings. Our story starts just after midnight, on October 19th, 1970. A young couple, Air Force Academy cadet Robert Bennett and his fiancée, were sitting in their parked car on a quiet wooded road. Suddenly, they saw movement in the rearview mirror. A figure emerged from the darkness. As it got closer, they saw it was a man dressed in a white suit, and then he threw something. The front passenger window shattered. The figure standing outside screamed at them, "You're on private property, and I have your tag number." Panicked, Bennett floored it. It wasn't until they were safely down the road that they looked down and found a wood-handled hatchet on the floor of their car. When they reported the bizarre attack, their description must have sounded like a prank. Bennett was adamant. The man was wearing a white suit with long bunny ears. His fiancée remembered it a little differently, saying it was more of a pointed white cap, but they both agreed on the suit, the hatchet, and the terrifying, unprovoked rage. A few days later, the Washington Post ran the story with the headline, "Man in bunny suit sought in Fairfax." The legend had just been born. For 10 days, Everything was quiet. But then on the evening of October 29th, the bunnyman showed up again. This time, the witness was a security guard named Paul Phillips. He was checking on a new, unfinished housing development when he saw a man standing on the porch of an empty house. Phillips said he was wearing a gray, black and white bunny costume, and in his hand he held a long-handled axe. Phillips cautiously approached and asked the man what he was doing. The man in the bunny suit just started methodically chopping at a wooden porch post. "All you people trespass around here," he warned. "If you don't get out of here, I'm going to bust you on the head." Phillips wisely got back in his car and called the police. By the time they arrived, the axe-wielding rabbit was gone. All that was left was the damaged porch post, with 8 clear chop marks in the wood. This second incident solidified it. This wasn't just a story. There really was someone in Fairfax County dressing up in a bunny costume and threatening people with an axe. Police launched a huge investigation, but despite over 50 more calls from people claiming to have seen the bunnyman, no suspect was ever identified. The police file was eventually closed, with one report concluding with the surreal sentence, "After a very extensive investigation, it is still unsubstantiated as to whether or not there really is a white rabbit." So how did we get from 2 documented bizarre incidents to a supernatural slasher who hangs teenagers from a bridge? This is where fact bleeds into folklore. The incidents in 1970 created a sensation. The story was amplified by newspapers and became the talk of the region. The Colchester Overpass, a narrow single-lane tunnel built in 1906, was already an inherently spooky place. As the story was told and retold, it needed a lair, and the bridge was the perfect candidate. Teenagers started daring each other to drive to Bunnyman Bridge, and with each telling, the story grew more elaborate. The most gruesome parts of the legend, the asylum escapee, the murdered kids, were just fabrications added over time to make a good story even better. Brian A. Conley, a historian for the Fairfax County Public Library, did extensive research and debunked these claims. He found no evidence of any asylum bus crash or an escaped patient named Douglas Griffon. The true story of the Bunnyman isn't about ghosts or murder. It's about how 2 strange, unsolved crimes sparked a local panic and evolved into one of America's most enduring urban legends. The real Bunnyman was probably just an angry property owner, furious about trespassers, but his bizarre choice of a costume, combined with his violent threats, elevated him from a simple criminal into a mythological figure. The real man was never caught, leaving a void that our collective imagination was more than happy to fill. From the haunted bridges of Virginia, our journey into the darkness is just getting started. If you're finding this look behind the legends as fascinating as I am, take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. It really helps the channel out. Now we travel north to the winding country roads of western Pennsylvania, specifically the area around Coppell and State Route 351. If you grew up there any time in the last 70 years, you've heard the stories of the Green Man, or as he's more ominously known, Charlie No Face. The legend paints a chilling picture. Late at night, along a lonely stretch of road, a monstrous figure walks in the darkness. He has no face, and his skin glows with an eerie supernatural green light. Some say he was a power company worker who was horribly electrocuted. Others whisper that he was struck by lightning, or that he's a demon. For decades, it was a rite of passage for local teenagers to drive down his haunted road, hoping for a terrifying glimpse of Charlie No Face. They'd speed through the so-called Green Man's Tunnel, a graffiti-covered railroad tunnel that became the legend's focal point, even though it was miles from where he actually walked. But this isn't a story about a monster. It's a story about a man whose profound personal tragedy was twisted by fear and misunderstanding into a terrifying piece of folklore. The real story behind the Green Man is the heartbreaking and deeply human tale of Raymond Robinson. Raymond Robinson was born in 1910 in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. By all accounts, he was a normal, happy kid, but his life changed forever on a summer day in 1919. Ray, who was just 8 years old, was out with friends near a railroad bridge that carried a high-voltage trolley line. Another boy had actually been killed there less than a year earlier. Accounts vary, but the most common story is that Ray climbed a pole to look at a bird's nest and accidentally touched a live wire carrying an estimated 22,000 volts. The shock was catastrophic. Doctors were stunned he survived at all, but the damage was devastating. He lost both his eyes, his nose, one ear, and his right arm. His face was left permanently and profoundly disfigured. The healthy young boy was gone, replaced by a survivor of an unimaginable trauma. After the accident, Raymond's life became one of quiet seclusion. He lived with his family, who loved and cared for him. To pass the time and earn a little money, he made doormats, wallets, and belts by hand. He loved listening to the radio, especially baseball games, but he couldn't live a normal life. His appearance was so startling that going out during the day would cause panic, stares, and cruelty from strangers. So to get some fresh air and exercise, Raymond began to take long walks, but he only ever did it at night. For decades, this was his routine. After dark, he would leave his home and walk along a quiet stretch of State Route 351, using a walking stick to feel his way. And it was during these solitary, nocturnal walks that the legend of the Green Man was born. Drivers would be cruising down the dark country road, and suddenly, their headlights would catch a lone figure walking by the shoulder. In that brief, shocking moment, they'd see his scarred face, with no eyes and no nose. To an unsuspecting person, the sight was terrifying. Word began to spread about the faceless phantom who haunted Route 351. The nickname Charlie No Face is pretty self-explanatory. The origin of the Green Man isn't supernatural at all. Some locals think it was because he often wore a green shirt. Another theory is that the severe burns might have given his damaged skin a slightly greenish tint, which would have been exaggerated by passing headlights. There was no eerie glow. There was only a man walking in the dark. Over the years, two different stories emerged. There were the locals who knew Raymond's story. They knew he was a kind, harmless man who had suffered a terrible tragedy. Some would even stop their cars to chat with him, bringing him cigarettes or a beer. But then there was the legend. This was the story told by teenagers and outsiders, the one that stripped away his humanity and replaced it with horror. To them, Raymond wasn't a person. He was a boogeyman, to be hunted for sport. They would pile into cars and go green manning, driving up and down his walking route. While some were just curious, others were cruel. He was harassed, and more than once, he was even hit by cars. Still, he continued his walks. Raymond Robinson's life is a heartbreaking look at how legends are born. His story wasn't rooted in crime, but in tragedy, and our tendency to fear what we don't understand. His private suffering became public entertainment. The very thing he did to find peace, walking alone at night, is what turned him into a monster in the eyes of others. Raymond eventually moved into the Beaver County Geriatric Center, where he passed away in 1985 at the age of 74. He was loved by his family and neighbors, but for many, his true story is still overshadowed by the ghostly legend he never asked for. A chilling reminder that sometimes human cruelty is more monstrous than any imaginary creature. For our final story, we head to Staten Island, New York. Here, a local boogeyman story. A cautionary tale told to kids for decades would collide with a horrifying reality. This is the story of Cropsy. The legend of Cropsy is a classic of playground horror. Like most boogeymen, he has a few origin stories. Some say he was an escaped patient from a mental institution, a madman with a hook for a hand or a bloody axe who stalked the woods, waiting to snatch kids who wandered too far from home. For generations of kids on Staten Island, Cropsey was the reason you had to be home before dark. He was the monster in the woods. And on Staten Island, there was a very real, very terrifying place for this monster to live: the abandoned grounds of the Willowbrook State School. You can't understand the story of Cropsey without understanding the horror of Willowbrook. Opened in 1947, it was a state-funded institution for children with intellectual disabilities. It was designed for 4,000 residents, but by the mid-1960s, its population was over 6,000. In 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy toured the facility and said the residents were living in filth and dirt, in rooms less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which we put animals in a zoo. But the full, sickening truth was blown wide open in 1972, when a young reporter named Geraldo Rivera and his camera crew got inside. The exposé, Willowbrook, the last great disgrace, showed children left unattended in their own waste, rocking endlessly. It revealed rampant disease and abuse. Willowbrook wasn't a school, it was a snake pit. The public outcry was immense, and the school was finally forced to close in 1987. After it closed, the massive campus, with its decaying buildings and underground tunnels, was left to rot. It became the perfect real-world setting for a boogeyman. The legend of Cropsey, the escaped patient from the local asylum, now had a very specific home. For decades, Cropsey was just a story, a ghost in the machine of childhood fears. But in the 70s and 80s, as the legend grew around the real-life horror of Willowbrook, something changed. Children on Staten Island started to disappear. For real, and the line between a boogeyman and a real-life monster vanished. This is the story of Andre Rand. Born Frank Rushan in 1944, Andre Rand had a troubled history. From 1966 to 1968, he worked as a custodian at the Willowbrook State School. After leaving his job, he became one of the many homeless people who lived in the woods on the abandoned grounds. He was a known figure, a strange man who was often seen trying to befriend local kids. His criminal record was deeply disturbing. In 1969, he was convicted of kidnapping a young girl. In 1983, he commandeered a school bus with 11 children on board and took them on a trip to Newark Airport, a stunt for which he served 10 months in jail. Over 15 years, a number of children vanished from Staten Island. 5-year-old Alice Pereira in 1972. 7-year-old Holly Ann Hughes in 1981. Tia Heath Jackson in 1983. Henry Gafforio in 1984. With each disappearance, the fear intensified, and the whispers grew louder. They all seemed to orbit one man, Andre Rand, and one place, the haunted grounds of Willowbrook. The breaking point came in the summer of 1987. A 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome, named Jennifer Schweiger, went missing. A massive search was launched, and suspicion immediately fell on Andre Rand. 35 days later, searchers found Jennifer's body in a shallow grave, buried in the woods on the Willowbrook property, not far from one of Rand's makeshift campsites. The community's worst fears were real. The boogeyman was real. The monster from the stories was living among them. Andre Rand was arrested. The jury, however, deadlocked on the murder charge due to a lack of direct physical evidence. But they did convict him of first-degree kidnapping, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Years later, prosecutors revisited the case of Holly Ann Hughes, the little girl who vanished in 1981. In 2004, a jury convicted Andre Rand of her kidnapping, adding another 25 years to life sentence, ensuring he would almost certainly never be free again. Andre Rand became the living embodiment of the Cropsey legend. He was the former employee from the dreaded local institution. He lived in the dark woods that parents warned their children about, and he snatched children. Staten Islanders already had a name for the monster in the woods. The arrest of Andre Rand just gave that monster a face. The story of Cropsey is the most terrifying of all, because it's the one that came true in the most direct and brutal way. It's a story that proves sometimes the warnings are real. Sometimes the boogeyman is not just a story, and sometimes he's been hiding in plain sight all along. From a bizarre prankster in a bunny suit, to a tragic man who was misunderstood, to a real-life predator hiding in plain sight, these stories show that reality is often the most powerful source of fear. The legends we tell around the campfire aren't always born from imagination. Sometimes they're echoes of the truth. Whispers of real crimes and real tragedies, too strange not to be retold. They remind us that the scariest monsters are usually human. So, what do you think? Which one of these true stories got to you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you know of another urban legend with a true story behind it, I definitely want to hear about it. Thanks for watching.